If you live in the eastern half of the states, and if your neighborhood has mature trees, or even should you be so lucky a stretch of woods nearby, you can expect at your feeders 4 foraging friends. That clarion "Peter, Peter, Peter" announces the first of them, the tufted titmouse, with his pertly peaked head, black forehead, alert black eyes, and subtle wash of rust under the wings. Next are the chickadees, which come in 2 practically indistinguishable species, the black-capped chickadee if you live in the north, or the Carolina chickadee if you're further south. Our smallest woodpecker, the downy, is serenaded by a chickadee as he lands. The downy is a black and white, checkered and striped, airborne optical illusion. Males have a dash of red on the back of the head that females don't. And finally, the white-breasted nuthatch. If you spend much time outside, you're bound to hear his nasal yank, yank. He lets you know when he's around. And look for him on tree trunks, skittering around in 5 directions at once like a wind-up toy. No other bird habitually eats head downward. If in bad light you see a down-facing, head-cocked checkmark of a bird, it's a safe bet it's a nuthatch. In rural areas with lots of woods, these 4 types of birds hang together in cold weather. They're wintertime buddies, partly so they'll have more eyes on the skies looking for predators. Notice how the downy keeps glancing up. And partly to cooperate in finding food. Seeds, nuts, berries, and even though it's winter, insect larvae and eggs. The white-breasted nuthatch contributes to the search by flipping bits of tree bark off branches in search of larvae. If these 4 birds have access to feeders, though, they won't bother flocking because they don't need to. Food is so easy to find. And studies have shown that downy woodpeckers and tufted titmice who have access to feeders in winter are better nourished than their counterparts. The same surely must hold true for the nuthatches and chickadees. The other reason that these birds are unlikely to flock in winter if they can go to feeders is that they have the help of all the other small birds in your yard to warn them of predators. These woodland birds must weave among branches and twigs, whether they're evading a predator or searching for food. So like most woodland birds, they undulate in flight, flapping a few times, then tucking their wings and gliding. It's sort of like how you would tuck your elbows to your sides to squeeze through a partly open door, except they're doing it at speed, over and over like an obstacle course, and dipping with every tuck. Oop, mind that low branch zipping up at you. Tucking their wings also helps them break for landings. The chickadee dips so much more than the other birds that undulate that this effervescent little guy doesn't dip so much as bounce. On the windiest of the cold days, the nuthatches, titmice, chickadees, and downies hunker down in the center of a woods to escape the wind. On days like that, these birds have to do a cost-benefit analysis before visiting your feeders, weighing the benefit of easy-to-find food against the cost, letting that bitter wind buffet their bitsy bodies. So they may be scarce at feeders on cold, windy days, but they'll show up plenty over the course of the season. All you have to do is bribe them. They can be had for the price of a few high-fat foods. A peanut feeder seduces them with fatty nuts. Another high-fat food that will lure them in is sunflower seeds, either with husks, which is black oil sunflower, or without husks. Everyone but the downy will also eat the less fatty safflower and Niger seeds. This cylinder feeder of nuts, fat, and sunflower seeds appeals to everyone but the chickadee. The downy settles in and jackhammers there with the zeal of someone who digs his own nest holes. Of course, if you want woodpeckers, what you need is suet. The others will eat it once in a while, but the downy can grip the bars with his strong feet, brace his tail, and practically live there. And finally, there's bark butter, the bird version of peanut butter. Need I say more about its appeal? Any nuthatches, chickadees, titmice, or downies with access to feeders are privileged. Wealthy, you might say. But even without your help, they could survive. Always have done. Since these birds don't migrate, they're born with a plan for how to feed themselves when winter makes food scarce and hunger comes a-calling. Despite all the fatty foods they eat, they aren't aiming to fatten up like a bear, because if the size of a bird doubles, he'll need 8 times as many calories in order to fly. So scratch that idea. What they do instead is to cache lots of food for later. Now, the downies don't bother with that, but the other 3 do. In autumn especially, they're busy gathering seeds and nuts to hide. Their hippocampus, the area of the brain where spatial memories are stored, is larger than the hippocampus of birds that don't store food, big enough to enable them to remember where they've hidden hundreds or even thousands of seeds, all scattered over an area that contains hundreds of trees and thousands upon thousands of pieces of bark. And keep in mind that it's not like anything is labeled when you're in the woods. We know that these intelligent bird brains can keep track of their stash without benefit of post-it notes for at least a month. Next time I can't find the mustard in my fridge, I'm just going to call on my inner titmouse. No, that probably wouldn't work. I don't know about your memory, but if a chickadee had to depend on mine, he'd be one dead chickadee before mid-January. When you see one of these birds leaving the feeder with a seed or a nut in its beak, then it might be stocking its pantry. But caching isn't the only reason these birds carry food away. Their bills dictate that they order from the takeout menu. You see, they love those fatty sunflower seeds and nuts, but biting into those foods isn't like crunching, say, a grape, and they don't have strong bills. Finches and grosbeaks, such as cardinals, have nutcrackers for bills. And by the way, house sparrows, despite their name, are actually finches with strong, bulky finch beaks. All the members of this group, on the other hand, have tweezers for bills. Or to be more charitable, let's say that they work with an ice pick instead of a vise. The pointed bills of downy woodpeckers, chickadees, titmice, and nuthatches are built for poking into crevices in tree bark as they search for insects. Useful more for pecking and pounding than for crunching. Well, life is full of trade-offs. None of these 4 species have a bill as strong as a house sparrow's, but I've noticed that the titmouse and the chickadee are adept at pulling a whole peanut loose. The beefed-up beaks of house sparrows, on the other hand, ram into the nuts but seldom slip between them to get a grip. So they usually end up pulverizing the peanut for parts. Which, come to think of it, is what the titmouse ends up doing anyway. All of these dainty-billed birds have to clamp a claw over each end of a seed and hammer it open. Something they're perfectly willing to do, but they'd rather not sit out in the open, visible to a Cooper's hawk on the hunt, while they work bent over their feet hammering. Now see, that's not an issue for a cardinal, who need only glance down long enough to grab a seed, and then, while absent-mindedly pulverizing it with a beak that could open a beer can, the cardinal is free to look in every direction for predators. Same with finches. Meanwhile, a chickadee has flown to cover with his treat. Again and again. It's like going back to the kitchen from the dining room for every couple of bites you eat. But for a class of birds so careful with their stashes, these little guys are cavalier about tossing seeds away at a feeder. They're probably doing it in order to make the most of every trip. What I mean is that it's been shown that a titmouse always wants the biggest sunflower seed he can get. He just wants to make every one of his umpteen dozen trips worthwhile. So of course he's going to flip the runty seeds aside. And if it's black oil sunflower seeds they're rejecting, keep in mind that they may be dropping the empty husks left by cardinals and house sparrows. By the way, Europeans would call this bird a tit rather than a chickadee. Don't know why we named it something else, unless we thought tit was too titillating. There's one more reason why these birds are willing to make all those trips with food. It suits their personalities. None of these four feel comfortable in a crowd the way sparrows and finches do. Flocking birds thrive on closeness and conflict. But these four birds haven't evolved the sharp elbows it takes to jostle their way around in a crowd. I said at the outset that they travel in loose flocks. Loose meaning not this. They prefer flockmates who give them yards, not inches, of personal space. And besides, the chickadee is so petite that he has to stretch to reach that hole. So even a goldfinch or a housefinch looks like Goliath to him. He's usually going to hang out, waiting for a lull in the action, dash in to grab a seed, perhaps buzzing chickadee dee 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 as he comes. He's one of those birds that moves from perch to perch like a hiccup. Just way too much of a fuss budget to tolerate crowds. And yet he and the titmouse are surprisingly tolerant of human activity. Now, unlike the chickadee, the downy need not cower away from goldfinches. He's about the same size they are. But so what? Their food doesn't much tempt him. He'll eat the occasional sunflower seed, and peanuts for sure, and he'll carry them away. Not to cache them, because he doesn't do that, but just to open them in peace and safety.